on the phone the editor of the UN Dispatch and also the host of Global Dispatches, a podcast which some have said is actually like the WTF for foreign policy. Mark Leon Goldberg, welcome to the program.
Thanks.
So, Mark, I want to talk about Iraq and obviously this news that has come out in the past couple of days about Sunni insurgents taking over and controlling Mosul, the second biggest city in Iraq. And obviously, to talk about that, we also need to talk about what's happening in Syria. But let's start with the most recent news. We're now, I guess, 11 years from when we first invaded and occupied Iraq illegally, from my perspective. But nevertheless, the country obviously is still not stable. Tell us what has taken place over the past a year or so that has led us to this point.
Sure. So there have been like a slow and steady sort of list and a slow and steady number of minor attacks, you can say minor atrocities, mostly committed by Sunni insurgents against Shia populations. You know, you have these sort of car bombs or suicide attacks that kill 26 people at a time, 30 people at a time, 40 people at a time. But these happen sort of week after week, month after month, to the point where the death toll in Iraq are reaching levels sort of unseen since the end of the war. So this has been happening sort of slowly over the last probably year or so. And the government of Nouri al Maliki has been unable to control things. His is a very weak governing coalition. He tactically doesn't have the forces or the capacity to, go toe-to-toe with these ISIS insurgents, the insurgents that just took over the city of Mosul and now are perhaps even marching their way to Baghdad. So the situation is certainly very dire. And as you said, we're now 11 years and 6 weeks from the time that George Bush declared mission accomplished. And, it seems that Iraq is becoming a safe haven for al-Qaeda.
And this is, I guess the ultimate irony, or the maybe that's just too flip of a word. But what is? Tell us, when you say ISIS, what is? Who is ISIS, and what does that stand for?
So this group is called the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria. This is a cross-border al-Qaeda affiliated terrorist group, and actually al-Qaeda disowned them. They were seen as a little too extreme for even al-Qaeda. But they, for the past several years, have had a foothold in parts of Syria that border Iraq, and have used that as a way to launch attacks into Iraq proper. And given the lawlessness in Syria, they've just been able to grow and mesticize to the point where they're this legitimately forceful militant group. And they're called the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria. And until this week, they were probably just a state in name only. But now it seems as if they really are carving out a significant territorial swaths for themselves.
I mean, if folks take a look at a map of Iraq, and if you draw a line essentially from Mosul down through Fallujah, which they control, and the Anbar province, I mean, you're looking at, nearly half of the landmass of Iraq. When we say they control it, do they control the major cities? Is that it? And everything else in between is just sort of a no man's land?
Yeah. So in Mosul, for example, they are controlling sort of all the seats of authority, the airport, all the important buildings, government facilities. That's under their control. And that's been the case in Fallujah for a while now. I mean, your viewers who were old enough to remember these names of these towns in 2003, 2004, 2005, will recall these were the sites of pretty big battles between the U.S. coalition forces and then the old Saddam Hussein holdovers and other insurgents. And now they're just sort of in the hands of this al-Qaeda affiliated group.
Do we know who these people are and how many of them are there? Are these former Baathists? Are they foreign fighters? Did they
So
start out by being attracted to what was going on in Syria and then sort of migrate?
So I think it's a combination of all things. And the background of this, though, is this Sunni Shia divide that's become more acute over the last several years in Iraq and in Syria. As the situation in Syria descends more and more into sectarian violence, the natural inclination is for people to seek shelter with people who share their ethnic affiliation. And so Sunnis, who are a minority in Iraq and who have opposed the presidency of Nouri al Maliki, who is a Shia, have, well, not, I don't want to presume that they are supporting ISIS, but they certainly feel besieged by the Iraqi government and not represented by the Iraqi government. So it's not unreasonable to expect that there is some bed of support for Sunni insurgency. Now, that's to say, it's hard, I think, to make the case that a group that advocates this hardline brand that ISIS does has a wide degree of popular support, but it's certainly there, and I think it's certainly there because of heightened sectarian tensions that are a result of the spillover from the conflict in Syria.
And Reuters reported that on Wednesday morning, the ISIS fighters and the Levant, which I guess, and you tell me, seems to be sort of another loosely affiliated group, have now begun to take over the oil refinery on the outskirts of Baji, which is south of Mosul. What are the implications of their takeover? And from the reports, it seems like people don't necessarily know who these guys are, but they're basically giving advance notice to just lay down your arms. We'll come in and we're just going to liberate you, I guess.
Well, just a quick point that sort of the Levant group is just another name for ISIS.
Okay.
Levant is a geographical term that suggests that part of the world. But yeah, so I mean, the capture of Mosul seems to indicate just what you said, that from all reports, the Iraqi government, the Iraqi military forces that were supposedly guarding the city from this attack had been just laid down their arms. And they seem utterly incapable of repelling ISIS's attack. Now, the key question is whether other countries in the region might intervene. Turkey, for example, had scores of its diplomats kidnapped. They had a consulate in Mosul that was overrun, and their consul general and many other people were kidnapped by ISIS. And Turkey has been indicated and has been suggesting that they might take matters into their own hands. And they are the big, powerful military in the region, and of course a NATO ally. So that is certainly a question and a trend to watch in the coming days, is how Turkey is responding to this all.
What I mean, there seems to be so many different cross currents here, because we also have apparently the Iraqis, or I should say the Iraqis, in terms of the al Maliki administration regime, also now asking the Kurds to repel these insurgents, who, of course, have I guess what we call a semi-autonomous. I don't know if it's fair to call it a state, but that basically borders Mosul. I mean, and my understanding is that Turkey. I mean, would Turkey intervene here to prevent the Kurds from intervening and bringing about some form of independence? There just seems to be so many different cross currents here.
There are, and the one thing to sort of know about the Kurdish region is that, yes, as you said, they are semi-autonomous, and they've also been largely insulated from the sectarian violence that's occurred elsewhere in Iraq. And on top of that, they do have the most competent fighting force, in Iraq right now. Their militias are, they know how to fight and could potentially repel ISIS. But yeah, the question of Turkey and the Kurds is just another overlapping complication here because Turkey has always been wary of the Kurdish, the very same Kurdish militias that could be used to repel ISIS because of Kurds' own questions and desires for carving out a Kurdish state on Turkey's southern border. So yeah, I mean it's very difficult. And on top of this is of course the question of Syria, that you can't defeat ISIS without defeating ISIS in Syria. And so far, no government, no country has been willing to mount an outside intervention into Syria. Whether or not, leaving aside whether or not that's wise, I think it's probably correct to say that ISIS will remain a potent force so long as they have this base of support and this free reign that they have in Syria.
So, where does ISIS fit into the conflict, the civil war in Syria? I mean, they are one of the forces fighting against Assad.
Yes, yeah. So they are one of the extremist groups fighting Assad. The other biggest extremist group that I think has a bit more sway in local cash is the al-Nusra Front. But ISIS and the al-Nusra Front are two extremist groups who are fighting Assad. So theoretically, they could be allied with Turkey in that goal, which Turkey also is stridently anti-Assad at this point. So it's all, I think, very complicated. But the key point is that until the crisis in until the crisis in Syria is solved, you're going to see this festering conflict, not just in Iraq, but throughout the region. Kofi Annan, a few years ago, when he was the sort of lead diplomat on Syria, said that Syria is a crisis that Syria is not going to explode. It's not. Pardon me. Syria is not going to implode. It's going to explode and spread instability throughout the whole region. And you're seeing that in Iraq. You're seeing that in Lebanon, potentially in Jordan, where a refugee situation is threatening the stability of the kingdom there. So it's just a really dodgy and volatile situation that has consequences, not just for the Middle East and the region, but worldwide.
Well, let's broaden out here. Who is supporting? Where is ISIS getting their funding and their weapons from?
They mostly from so again, they have at this point they're sacking cities, and so for example in Mosul they've controlled the armed cache there. There are reports that they now could potentially, if they know how to operate, have like a whole bunch of helicopters at their disposal. So initially, their support came from the same kind of Al-Qaeda type supports, and they could also be getting support from Gulf region monarchies who are seeking to oust Assad, because again they are allied with they are politically at least allied for now with the same kind of countries in the Gulf, like Saudi Arabia, Qatar, the Emirates, that are seeking the ouster of Assad. And they're opposed by Iran, which is seeking to prop up Assad. So you're seeing like a regional kind of proxy war play itself out in Iraq and Syria right now, with one side supporting Assad, the other side supporting these extremist groups that are opposing Assad.
And so from the Sunni Gulf states, it's almost a twofer, right? With ISIS, because on one hand it is a way of both attacking Assad and I guess fighting this proxy war with Iran in terms of influence over Iraq.
Yes, yeah. I mean that's I think a very good way to put it. And the support mostly comes in form of funding, but the question is, are they backing these groups to their own detriment? I mean, a lot of these groups, they might be tactically aligned with the geopolitical and geostrategic goals of Saudi Arabia right now, but down the road, when an empowered al-Nusra Front or would empowered ISIS actually threaten the Saudi monarchy, probably yes, especially if they, as what is appearing to happen now, if they can carve out a mini state for themselves on the border of Iraq and Syria, which sort of seems to be happening.
And particularly, I imagine, if they control some oil fields around Mosul and the refineries. Because my understanding is that the refineries up there provide oil to Baghdad and the rest of Iraq.
Yeah, I mean, so I mean, the sources of their funding, if they control these oil fields, could be unlimited. Now, there are probably ways that the international oil market could try to clamp down on those specific oil fields. It's, I think, a little far afield to speculate on that, but I mean, the potential is certainly there, and it's frightening. It's scary.
Yeah. So going back, because I want to sort of now start to look at this from, I guess, an American perspective. But before we do, I mean, what wasn't this inevitable? Essentially, the day that maybe the day that we invaded and occupied, or certainly the day that we began a de-Baathification program in Iraq. I mean, was there any other possible outcome at this point? I mean, what could they have possibly been?
No, I think there are several missteps along the way. I mean, I certainly did not support the U.S.-led invasion and occupation of Iraq. But that said, there were several mistakes that the Americans and later Nouri al Maliki made that helped give rise to this Sunni insurgency. Nouri al Maliki just started out okay, but seems to be a politician who is incapable of having any appeal across sectarian lines. His appeal is exclusively among Shia parties, and to the exclusion of Sunnis. And I think after the fall of Saddam Hussein, you saw ethnic identities and religious identities become more and more acute, particularly as the security situation deteriorated so rapidly in 2003, 2004, when the U.S. was unable to maintain control and to stop the looting. I mean, you remember all those images. In that situation, people kind of find people like themselves and find militias like themselves to protect them from the other. And you saw this sort of heightening sectarian awareness and heightening sectarian tensions that have continued, to this day, and they're seemingly only getting worse. I mean, as I said at the top of this interview, over the course of the year, week after week, month after month, there have been attacks, mostly by Shia against Sunni, of like 20 people killed at a market here, 15 people gunned down at their mosque there. I mean, it has been unrelenting, and this is just the culmination of that.
And I mean, what the Shiite are in power, and yet they're still Maliki didn't have the ability to basically restrain these type of attacks?
Yeah, I think that once you saw the U.S. leave in 2011 or so, then you saw sort of this tactical ability to go after the bad guys evaporate, right? Like I was speaking to an Iraq expert the other week who said, JSOC, the Joint Special Operations Command, is much, much better at hunting down Al-Qaeda cells than is the Iraqi army, which is like a second-tier, power. So it's part of it is that just tactical question that this is partly a consequence of the U.S. withdrawal.
And of course, though, and people should be clear that, and because this is where we start getting into American domestic politics. I don't know if it's because of the Benghazi or Bergdahl or any myriad of other of Republican favorite scandals at this point. But at one point, we're going to start hearing, right, that President Obama lost Iraq.
So I think what you're probably going to start hearing, I got into this on Twitter with a few of my American political watchers, is that, so I think the salient political argument that will be leveled against Barack Obama is that by not doing enough to support the moderate Syrian insurgents, that he sort of helped engender the situation where the hardcore, the extremist Syrian insurgents were the ones that were getting the money and the guns and were able to attract the recruits and followers. And so he almost sort of the argument that I think you'll probably being seen made over the next few weeks, assuming things get worse, progressively worse in Iraq, which they probably will, is that by not doing enough to support moderates against Assad, the extremists got their foothold and were able to attract more recruits and more money and became the powerful force that they are today. So that's, I think, the argument you'll see. It's a bank shot, so maybe it might not have the same kind of political salience.
I was going to say, but who
I would expect, but it could be.
I mean, aside from and we're talking about two different things here almost simultaneously, sort of both sort of a legitimate policy argument and as to whether or not there would, what the implications, because we don't know the counterfactual, right? I mean, of what happens if the American government gets more or had gotten more aggressive about funding the Syrian, the anti-Assad forces early. But I mean, who's situated to make that argument in the political sphere? I mean,
So you saw that argument first being made by the former U.S. ambassador to Syria, who's a very respected diplomat named Robert Ford, who in a CNN interview last week sort of made that argument and said that's why he resigned his position. I think he said he could no longer, represent the United States given those kind of constraints. So he made that sort of accusation, though he did so, I think, apolitically. I wouldn't be surprised, however, if you see like the McCain crowd start to, attach themselves to that line of reasoning, and whether or not they can articulate it in a way that I think resonates with Americans who are deeply, deeply wary of getting involved in Iraq or Syria, for that matter, is I think to be seen.
And people should understand too that God forbid there was ever a desire to re-engage in Iraq with U.S. military personnel. The Iraqis, it was an Iraqi decision essentially to kick us out. I mean, I would like to think that we would get out anyways, but that we should make clear at this point.
Yeah, the Iraqis refused to sign a bilateral agreement with America that the Americans liked, that were acceptable to the Americans. I think the key issue is where people would be prosecuted in a court of law. Like, would an American soldier be liable under Iraqi law, or would they be able to be tried if they committed some atrocity in American courts? So I think that was one of the key issues. But yeah, the fact is that Iraq never signed a bilateral security agreement with the United States, therefore prompting America's withdrawal from Iraq. That was sort of the final sort of nail in the coffin, as it were.
To what extent does the payments that were involved essentially in the so-called surge, the paying to the sons of Iraq, and I guess it was the Iraqi awakening, or maybe it was referred to that, who were in the Anbar province? It was, for, I guess, people who are, it's amazing how much I think sort of Iraq has left the consciousness of Americans, and much of this history is already down the wormhole on some level. But the American military essentially bribed, and as far as I'm concerned, good use of money, better than dropping bombs, bribed Sunni insurgents to basically say, stand down to a certain extent. To what extent? I mean, are we talking about totally different people? I mean, is there any type of cross section here? Did we inadvertently sort of create the seeds of this Sunni insurgency?
I think there certainly is some overlap. I think the seeds of this particular insurgency, though, were sown in Syria. I mean, this is where they sort of the base of this particular group's support is. But I mean, going back to the surge, I mean, the key focal point of the surge was the city of Fallujah, which is now under the control of ISIS, of this Al Qaeda linked terrorist group. So I mean, to make the argument that the surge worked is a little tenuous now. Just kind of looking, what is it, surge was 2007, 7 years later. This group is now in control of the very focal point of the surge, the city of Fallujah.
Well, of course, we can't. I mean, that's 7 years ancient history these days, so we couldn't. Very hard to draw that line. Well, let's turn back to Syria, if we could. The short of and again, it's very hard to know what the implications would have been, and I guess maybe the argument is nature abhors a vacuum, and that by not arming a specific group, the more moderate factions early on in this rebellion, I guess, or this civil war in Syria, a vacuum was created, and it turns out ISIS and their affiliates are the ones who are armed and empowered. What can we do now? I mean, is there anything for America to do in this? Because first off, before you answer that question, give us a sense, because we see very little reporting of it, of just what a catastrophe and a tragedy is going on in Syria.
So there are over 9 million people in need of some sort of humanitarian relief in Syria that are displaced inside Syria and in the region. The conditions are dire. This is by far the worst humanitarian crisis of the modern era. Last year, the United Nations put out an appeal for humanitarian funding for $6.5 billion to support just the very basic food, medicine, a plastic sheet for a pregnant mother to give birth on, shelter, that sort of thing for people in need inside Syria, and Syrians who are living as refugees throughout the region. So they asked for $6.5 billion for just the most basic, dignity and basic things to keep people alive. And so far, they've only received about $1.8 billion of that. Or about 28% of the full funding. And that gap between $6.5 billion, which they need, and the $1.8 billion which they've received, means sort of dead kids, kids without polio vaccinations. Polio is on the resurgence in the region after being eliminated there decades ago. It means kids not getting vaccinations, kids not getting food, pregnant mothers not getting prenatal support, all sorts of things. So the most basic thing that the United States can do, that the Obama administration can do, is support humanitarian funding, support the UN's effort, and the UN is working through a number of NGOs to just provide food and medicine to the people affected by this crisis. There were a lot of missteps along the way. The diplomacy on Syria right now is just absolutely stuck at the international level, and it doesn't seem to be getting unstuck anytime soon. So until we come up with a diplomatic or political solution to this conflict, the most basic thing we can do is provide a modicum of humanitarian relief to the people affected by this crisis. Is there
any support for this in the Senate or the House? I mean, is anybody championing this?
Well, people say they support it, but you just look where the dollars are coming from. Yes, to be fair, the United States is the single largest contributor to this $6.5 billion appeal, but the contribution levels are just not commensurate with the needs. While the U.S. is the largest, it still can do more, and it still needs to do more, as do other countries in the region, particularly wealthy countries in the Gulf.
These are the same. These are the same countries that are ostensibly also sort of fueling what could potentially turn into another crisis in Iraq.
Right. I mean, it's as I said, there is no near-term, or at this point even it looks like a long-term, political or diplomatic solution to this crisis. Things are stuck at the Security Council. Russia and the United States are at loggerheads over what to do here, and that is just sort of freezing any sort of international momentum towards a political or diplomatic solution. In the absence of that, like the most basic moral thing we can do is just give money to people who need it to buy food.
Do we have
people I should say, who are not parties to the conflict,
right.
people who are non-combatants and civilians.
Do we have at this point a comprehensive or a statable foreign policy for this region? I mean, it just seems like the only thing we have is putting out fires, but that most of the work is just trying to figure out where we get the water from.
Yeah, I think like the most basic priority for the Obama administration, and not without good reason, is to stay out of Syria, and make sure it can stay out of Syria, and sort of set the conditions by which it need not intervene in Syria, which I think there's no appetite for, which it doesn't want to do. At the same time, like I said, the region is exploding and is becoming ever more volatile. Like you saw what happened in Iraq. In Lebanon, on a per capita ratio, there are the equivalent of the entire populations of France and Germany moving to the United States all overnight is the sort of per capita ratio of Syrian refugees in Lebanon. I mean, this is just like an insane stress that this is putting on the region. A country like Jordan, which is already politically unstable, which has deep economic crisis, is now host to over 1 million refugees, which are putting a strain on their own resources. The region is under threat by this festering conflict.
Mark, I got to ask you, as someone who is immersed in this, I mean, I remember quite vividly the buildup to the Iraq War and the declarations from everyone on the spectrum, from the neocons through to Thomas Friedman, promising us the democracy that is going to flourish once we are done there. And we are literally hundreds of thousands of deaths from those declarations. Iraqis, now Syrians, millions upon millions, it seems like, of displaced refugees. It's almost overwhelming, like the sense of despair that there doesn't seem to have even been a moment where there is a collective sort of awareness of what we've done and some type of lesson to take going forward. There's no accountability and not even a reckoning with the implications of these foreign policy. I mean, no one. And I'm guilty of this too. No one seems to be paying attention to any of this anymore.
It's you would think that the disaster that has been the Iraq crisis and now the Syria crisis would force people to reevaluate their worldviews, and that's happened to a few people. A few prominent thinkers have Andrew Sullivan's a good example. Peter Beinart, two people who supported the invasion of Iraq very aggressively from an early stage, now have come to reevaluate their views in I think more helpful ways, and in sort of given their themselves a hard look in the mirror. But I don't think we've come to the point where we recognize some of the fundamental mistakes were not just in execution, but in idea. The idea that you can send troops halfway across the world to stabilize a country where you don't speak the language, know nothing about, is far-fetched. And the challenge, the problems of that were not just in how the Bush administration at that point went about it, and certainly they made a lot of big mistakes, but the very idea of it in the first place was the problem. And I don't think we've made that leap yet, right? Like there are still people probably like on my side of the aisle, more liberal type folk who, blame the execution of the Iraq crisis, blame not having enough troops or the de-Baathification process and all that as the real reason this went wrong, not that this was just a very bad idea to start with, that
Right.
had zero chance of success.
Right, and frankly, there were people who were predicting this is exactly where we would be at this point, and it seems like it's only going to get worse. Mark Leon Goldberg, undispatch.com. Go there both for Mark's writings, but also his podcast. Mark, thanks so much for joining us.
Hey, thank you, Sam.